process. And basically, there's this motivation to support these important identities because they provide so much self-esteem. So whenever we act in ways that are in accordance to those meanings of our identities, it makes us feel good about ourselves. So if we have that student identity, let's say we're studying for a test and we get a good grade, that's going to make us feel good because we have this identity that we care about and we're acting in accordance with those meanings and values of the identity. Same with being on a sports team, getting along with our teammates, doing well in the sports that we're doing. Or if we're a curious, skeptical person, again, just, maybe learning something new can make us feel good. So there's a lot of positives of these identities in many ways, or just they can just be neutral in helping us navigate our social worlds. They can help us connect with other people, and generally we want to support them. The challenge then is whenever we have certain identities that bias us to process information in ways that are not consistent with the best available evidence. And one of the classic examples of this is politics, especially in American politics. We have very strong partisanship, polarization, and this greatly influences how two people will process the same information. And when I think about partisanship, I really like this figure from this paper from a few years ago because it really highlights a lot of what I'm talking about here, where partisan identities provide us with all these goals and needs that we care about. The big one is, our belonging goals. We connect with a group of like-minded people, but they also provide, philosophical goals, status goals. They help us make sense of a lot of things, and that influences our beliefs. And then you can weigh that against our motivation to be accurate. We do care about being accurate as humans, but if we have a bunch of other goals that outweigh that accuracy goal, then it might impact how we process certain pieces of information. So this connects to polarization and misinformation. By misinformation, I just mean false or misleading information. It's a broad umbrella term, and mostly what I'll be referring to is that biased information processing that I keep talking about. So again, in the United States, we have this very clear in-group and out-group, and this impacts how we process information. But importantly, I keep using these political examples as examples to illustrate this process, but these identity biases apply to us more broadly. It's just that, again, they make a very clean story and example to illustrate how they work. And one of the reasons for that, again, in the United States, we have this strong polarization where Democrats and Republicans view the world very differently, and they very much dislike each other. And this has been growing for the past few decades. Every year we see these lines between the two groups diverge even further on a variety of figures. And this also has real world impacts, as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic. Right from the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, we saw this divergence between Democrats and Republicans in how serious they considered the virus to be. And this was maintained throughout the pandemic. And this impacted a variety of health behaviors, such as the desire to get the coronavirus vaccine. In fact, one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans agree on is that they cannot agree on basic facts. So again, this connects to this idea of identity bias and how people see the world very differently. But it's important to consider taking this a step further beyond just, okay, people have these partisan identities and they bias us. I think it's important to consider a couple different pressure points that make us especially vulnerable to bias. And this is really getting into that idea of psychological literacy beyond just thinking about identities we have, thinking about how our identities intersect with other identities. And this is what's referred to social identity complexity. And all that means is whenever we have a greater number of important identities that are independent from each other, that is more complexity. So the opposite is whenever we have more identities that overlap with each other. This is important because whenever we have a lot of identities that are independent from each other, we tend to be more open to information. We tend to be tolerant to different types of people. And there's research showing that whenever we interact with lots of different people, this tends to create higher social identity complexity. So again, the opposite here is whenever we have a lot of identities that overlap in their meanings, which can create bias and vulnerability to misinformation. And critically, what's happening here is whenever we have identities that share a lot of meanings with other identities, there's this reinforcement process taking place, and they become more important to us and bias us even further. So when we think about politics again, some researchers have talked about political identities being these mega identities because they're so encompassing for how we see the world based on just a single identity that we have. And that if we can understand how identities influence us, this can actually reduce polarization and make us think more clearly. So, to share an example of this, this is an extreme example of someone who has low social identity complexity. So let's say that they have a political and religious identity. It doesn't necessarily matter what they are, but we can pretend that they share 100% of their meanings. So their religion and their politics completely align and there's no conflict. Then let's say they volunteer at their place of worship and they're friends with everyone at their particular place of worship. This means, in this particular example, this person has four important identities that they care about, and they share 100% of the meanings, which means if they encounter any information that challenges these identities, then it feels like a complete attack on their sense of self. All of their self-esteem that's derived from these social processes, these identity processes, they are all being reinforced by each other, and they're all within this narrow lens of meanings. So again, there isn't much room to think about other identities that matter to you because you're seeing the world through this narrow lens of identities that reinforce each other and provide you with 100% of your self-esteem. So that creates a lot of bias whenever you encounter information that challenges how you see the world. Conversely, if we have higher social identity complexity, we can have our religious and political identities, but let's say they don't overlap very much. In fact, sometimes they're in conflict, and we can think about them separately. Additionally, let's say we have a volunteer identity, but we volunteer somewhere completely apolitical, such as a pet shelter or something like that. And we have friends from a variety of political and religious backgrounds. This means that whenever we have a wide distance between these identities, there is no single identity or set of meanings that completely is reliant for us receiving self-esteem. So we have this broad reservoir to derive our self-esteem from. And whenever we experience information that challenges a belief or something that challenges our identities directly, we can think about the other types of self-esteem and social support we have, and it doesn't feel as like an entire attack on our sense of self, and we're better able to process that information more objectively and more carefully. So this is a useful exercise that some psychologists have talked about for, drawing your own identity map and thinking about how your identities intersect. So if you have time to think about this, you can actually just draw this out on a map and see how your identities connect with each other, where they overlap, how large certain identities are. You can make some of the circles bigger if they're more meaningful, for example, and try to reflect on where you're deriving a lot of your meaning from. So this is again connected to a lot of research showing that Democrats and Republicans have these biases, but I also think it's important to consider how this intersects with our social networks. When we think about the networks of people we associate with, we know that we prefer to associate with people who are similar to ourselves. This is called homophily in the sociological literature. And again, this connects to politics as well. Here's a picture of Facebook profiles of a typical conservative and liberal Facebook account. The blue dots are Facebook friends who are liberal. The red dot are conservative Facebook friends. And you could probably guess which is the typical liberal profile, which is the typical conservative profile. So again, we tend to associate with people similar to us. Why this matters is because we know whenever we're associating with people who share our beliefs, and they are able to actually reinforce our identities through this process of what's called mutual identity verification. And basically, what that means is that whenever we have this shared agreement in our network, we're mutually reinforcing each other. So you post something on social media, your friend who agrees with you likes it, they reshare it, and you're able to both increase the salience and importance of those identities that you care about. And this can create effects of greater bias and polarization. And this is what I found in some of my research as well. Again, thinking about political identities specifically, whenever people have greater shared agreement, they tend to be more biased in how they process information, political rumors, news headlines. I also looked at vaccine attitudes where people who had more Democrats in their network tended to have more support for vaccines, and the opposite effect was true for Republicans. One of the big findings with a lot of this research is just having one person different in your network that thinks differently than you politically significantly reduces your bias towards processing information. So again, this is another useful thing to consider is how much exposure to people who think differently than me do I have? Do I have at least one person who I connect with that thinks differently? And this is important because the type of relationship does matter here. Just being exposed to people who think different than you on social media is not really going to be the same as having a meaningful conversation with someone who has different politics, different ideologies. And that's because the social ties and the closeness of these social ties is especially important because we actually care about what that person thinks, and there's this level of mutual respect where we're considering their perspective. So it can be useful to think about the types of people we associate with and how their beliefs are potentially shaping our beliefs. All this is also connected to disinformation, which is just purposely trying to mislead people. It's important to consider how we might be vulnerable to bad actors trying to mislead us because of the identity biases that we have. And there's research showing that people who lack status and social support are especially vulnerable to extremism and propaganda. And again, you can connect this back to those social identity maps. If you have a small subset of identities, then you can see how if an identity comes in and provides you with a lot of meaning, that can take up a lot of space and provide you with that self-esteem you might have been missing. So, to summarize this part of the literacy, I think when we think about psychological literacy, it's important to think about our biases in terms of where they come from, because they really shape us for how we process information and how they shape our beliefs and can create vulnerability for believing misinformation and disinformation. So it's helpful to really think about the networks of people we associate with, the identities that we have, and how we can create diversity within our networks and within our identities. It's helpful to do this, but of course it's difficult to do this for many reasons, which I'm happy to talk about afterwards, as well as ways that can improve dialogue between different groups. And all of this is on the backdrop of thinking about how these various social factors influence who we trust. So that's another exercise that I think can be useful is actually thinking about people and institutions and groups that we trust or distrust and why that's the case. Because generally we trust people who not only do we think are competent in whatever specific task we're thinking about, but also we think, do these people have our best interests at heart? And that is a big factor of trustworthiness as well. So when we think about improving our psychological literacy, we can think about understanding our identity and network biases, and then also thinking about different ways to challenge our own beliefs and be open to changing our minds. This is connected to some research showing that if you actually prompt people to think about processing things in a more open-minded fashion, it can create less vulnerability to bias and misinformation. So just, having people think about their own beliefs and being more open-minded and basically just encouraging curiosity, reflection, and open dialogue before we interact with certain pieces of information can be very helpful. So that connects to this next concept of the actual pieces of information we encounter, which is media and information. So when I talk about media literacy, what I'm referring to here is the ability to critically evaluate media, fact check information, and evaluate sources, especially in this artificial intelligence age that we are in. Media literacy is another umbrella term that refers to lots of different skills and abilities. So I'll just talk about a few of those here today. Um, Again, it's this idea of evaluating media and information. So verifying the credibility of the source, identifying if you're being manipulated through a different technique or not. And again, reflecting on your own biases, and that kind of connects to psychological literacy as well. When people do have higher media literacy levels, they are better able to discern true versus false headlines. But this is an issue because most people tend to think they are better at this than they actually are. Also, people who say that they want to do their own research generally don't have very strong research skills on the aggregate. In fact, doing your own research is more of a signal of distrust than the ability to do careful fact checking. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. So, how do we improve media literacy? You can have people actually take classes and learn a variety of skills, but this is resource intensive. Not everyone has time to do an 8-week course or the financial ability to do it either. So, researchers have been developing these online games that teach various media literacy skills. Some researchers call these pre-bunking games because they are exposing you to different manipulation techniques or misinformation techniques before you encounter them in the wild. So instead of trying to debunk a myth afterwards, you're being taught what to look for ahead of time. And there's a variety of these games that have been shown to improve people's ability to spot manipulation and to be more thoughtful in how they process information. One is the bad news game, where you are playing a game of a person who wants to spread misinformation and gain a bunch of followers online. As you do that, you actually gain these badges, learning about how to discredit experts, for example, or use emotion and polarization to rile people up and share your content. This is a similar game to Harmony Square, where again, you're trying to sow discord in this peaceful town. And as you do so, you are gaining more followers and learning about how that is a very useful, for example, trolling or using emotion and trying to get people to share content or use the existing divides to share more sensationalist content. Another recent one that just came out, I think a couple months ago, specifically focuses on manipulation techniques for false information about vaccines. So in this one, it's a little bit different because you're interacting with these experts who are using faulty logic and reasoning to promote anti-vaccine misinformation, such as the naturalistic fallacy. You run into someone who says, "Oh, vaccines are not natural, therefore we can't trust them," and it breaks down why that is a fallacy and is not supporting what they're trying to argue. One of the games that I helped develop and evaluate is called Galifacta. It basically means fact game, and it's developed for an Indonesian audience, although we did translate it into English. And this had a different perspective because instead of spreading misinformation in the game, you're actually interacting with fictitious friends and family in a WhatsApp simulation where they spread a rumor with you in this chat, and you can actually click on the link that they shared with you. So here's this blog post of this tiger running around Jakarta, and you click on it and you see it doesn't really look very reputable. It just cites these rumors. It has this old image of a tiger that isn't even in the city, and you might say, this doesn't look very reputable, and then that's how you learn to these different media literacy skills. So that was another game that I worked on. Another thing that I worked on at Notre Dame was teaching people how to evaluate manipulated images. So there's a lot of deep fakes now today with videos and images, and there's certain things you can look for. Generally, they look a little bit too perfect, a little clean. The hands are still a little odd sometimes, as you can see here. And one of the studies that we did was actually teaching people how to look for these image manipulations, these common things to look out for. And we found that you can very quickly get people to be much better at spotting these manipulated images in just a quick online education format. So even though these are constantly evolving and there's always going to be different things to look out for, the good news is they you can quickly teach people in a scalable fashion. Another really interesting game related to this was this Spot the Troll quiz, teaching people how to spot trolls or fake accounts on social media. And people were better able to do this after they played the game. And an interesting finding also of this study was that when people played this game, they actually were retweeting much less afterwards. So they became more cautious about what they shared online, which I think is a good thing. As we move forward using these AI tools and AI agents, um, one thing that could be interesting is actually using them to teach critical thinking and media literacy. Here's a study that found that whenever people interacted with an AI chatbot who was programmed to poke holes in their conspiracy theory, basically they decreased their strength of belief of the conspiracy theory by about 20%. Because again, the chatbot is poking holes in their logic, and then they say, oh, maybe this is not as reputable as I previously thought. So they feel less confident in their statement. There's a variety of tools specifically that you can use to improve your media literacy. A big one that I like is the reverse image search on Google. So this picture was actually trending when there was a lot of flooding in the United States. But if you use the reverse image search on Google, so you just copy and paste the picture here, you would actually find that this particular picture was not real and it was from the movie The Day After Tomorrow. So when we think about media literacy tips, there's a few other skills that I think are really helpful. One big one is what's called critical ignoring. And critical ignoring is just basically being selective with what you pay attention to. So one thing that could be really helpful is to set time limits on the social media apps you use and to be aware that a lot of these apps and people on the apps are trying to hijack your attention and make you outraged so you spend more time on these social media websites. And that connects to not feeding trolls. So people who are, again, trying to get you riled up to spend more time on the internet. It's important to be thoughtful about who you interact with and what time you use on these platforms. And then also the idea of lateral reading is a really useful skill that a lot of scholars and librarians and historians use to try and evaluate the truthfulness of a particular claim. And I'll talk about that in just a moment here. But basically, I think critical ignoring is a really important part of media literacy because it's not just knowing how to fact check, but it also talks about being mindful of the time you spend online. So I think another really useful exercise is to do a screen time check periodically. So just go onto your Android or iPhone and check how much time you're spending on your phone every week and which apps are you using the most. It might be surprising just how much time you're using. And then you can set timers on your apps. I found that is really useful for me, and it's really easy to do. Again, when we think about social media, it's really important to think about how these platforms are designed and how these algorithms are trying to keep us online as much as possible, and also how people on these platforms are profiting from spreading division and outrage. And they know that we have these pre-existing biases, and they try to use those biases to pull us in even more. So it's really important to pause before sharing and just constantly try to nudge ourselves to be more reflective when we go on social media. I mentioned lateral reading before. So lateral reading here is basically instead of thinking vertically, which is just looking within the confines of an article and trying to debunk it within, seeing if it makes sense, the reasoning and arguments make sense, you're actually looking beyond the article. So you would copy and paste the author's name into Google and see what other people say about them. Are they biased? Do they have an agenda? Who's funding them? Then you can also see who's funding the media outlet that they're posting on. Does that media outlet have um, validity in how it processes its claims? Do they, mention if they make mistakes? Do they mention who's funding them? And you can try to think what their target audience might be, and you're cross-checking this against a variety of sources here. So you're seeing what a lot of different people are saying about this particular author and their media outlet that they're posting on. And this is a way to check the truth and accuracy of a source beyond just seeing if their argument makes sense. So, for example, some of the researchers who study lateral reading often use this website, minimumwage.com. And I like this one too because it seems really neutral when you Google minimumwage.com. It seems like, oh, it's just kind of analyzing the impact of minimum wage in the United States. But then if you click on who's funding it, you see that they are this really partisan, conservative, anti increasing the minimum wage group. And that's actually driving a lot of their analysis and kind of you can see why they show particular stats and analyses more than others. So it definitely has a lot of bias, but you might not check that from a quick glance at their website. A few other media literacy tools. I like this media literacy or media bias chart from Adfonts Media. They constantly update this, and it's not a perfect tool, but it gives you an idea of um, the reliability and partisan slant of a variety of media um, platforms, both traditional media, new media, independent media. And these analyses are done by people left, right, and center to try and give a balanced set of ratings. And so it gives you at least an idea of where people are coming from. I also like ground news that provides you a metric of how often people are talking about a particular headline. So if there is a news story that's mostly covered by left-wing media, you'll see that in the ground news app or website. Same with if it's mostly right-wing media that's covering it. You can also sign up for their premium subscription that tells you like the funding sources of all of the uh, different media outlets as well. The News Literacy Project is another really great resource for updating how we navigate um, media and information online. Pointer is another good one. And a lot of these broader things to look for media consist of seeing if they're transparent about their process, seeing if they offer corrections in what their content, and also funding disclosure. Are they honest about who is funding them and just sharing that process? And also thinking about how that might bias them as well. So when we think about media literacy, I like how there's now more discussion of how this connects to digital and AI literacy, and even more broadly, how this connects to psychology. So here, Media Literacy Now is another resource that talks about media literacy. And they very directly say that we should be trying to understand how consuming information impacts our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Similarly, how does artificial intelligence do the same? So, again, a major theme of my talk here is that a lot of these literacies intersect with each other and should be thought to be studied together as well and applied together to have the biggest impact. So when we think about media literacy, we can learn skills from classes, those online resources, or even these short pre-bunking games to keep us sharp in this information overload world. Constantly trying to think reading laterally instead of just vertically is very helpful. And we can use verification tools, reverse image search, and stuff like that as well. And again, it's important to combine that with our psychological literacy too. So, the last part I want to talk about here is what I call scientific literacy. Scientific literacy, how I view it, is learning basic statistics, research methods, and common flaws in scientific studies. It's not about being an expert in any particular field, but you're learning some basic research methods so you can at least identify glaring red flags that you might encounter. And I think part of this starts with just really understanding the scientific method and understanding that science is done by people and people can make mistakes. But generally, science is self-correcting because there's still this incentive structure to correct the science that is done. But trying to understand the people involved in this process can be really useful as well. So the scientific method is separate from the people actually doing it, and institutions that are doing the scientific method. So understanding how both of those operate can be really useful. One of the big red flags that I see for scientific misunderstandings is conflating correlation and causation. So correlation, just two things are happening together, but may not be related. Causation is whenever we're doing an experiment that actually tests if one variable directly affects the other. So one of the classic examples of this is seeing the positive correlation between ice cream sales and drownings. And the third variable there that it's not mentioned is weather. So people are outside more, they buy more ice cream. Unfortunately, they also are more likely to drown. So understanding that process is really helpful. I also think generalizability is another big one. So do the research findings apply to a larger group? So for example, if we're looking at college students for a particular survey or experiment, does that apply to a broader population that might have very different social media habits, for example? Another big one of these is animal studies. If we find a drug interaction in a mouse, is that going to have the same impact on a human? Also, we can think about the actual statistical methods used. And this is often referred to or often talked about in what's called p hacking. So, p is just the level of statistical significance. We often refer to it with this letter p. And generally, we want to get this p-value of less than 0.05 in our data. But what that means is that basically statistical significance is just how likely something is to occur by chance. But if you run a bunch of studies and you only report on the ones that confirm what you're trying to find, you can kind of dredge the data or selectively report the data so it appears like you found an effect, but really you just ran a bunch of studies and only reported the ones that you care about. And this can be because people are biased to, try and get funding or try to advance their careers or a variety of different things. I really like this website. It's called Hack Your Way to Scientific Glory, and it can really illustrate the how easy it is to p-hack by adding or selecting different variables. It uses politics in the economy, and this is what it looks like if you click on the link. Basically, in this particular format, we see we have included all of these political data for Democrats in power, and then all of these economic indicators. And in this particular set of data, we find that we have a p-value of less than 0.05. And it shows that when Democrats are in power, it has a negative effect on the economy. But if we just change one thing and we exclude recessions, so whenever there's a recession, we don't include that particular data, those data points, we then see it's no longer a statistically significant effect. So that's just one thing we either included or excluded, and it totally changes if something is statistically likely to occur or not. Another statistical method to consider is what's called effect sizes and confidence intervals. And just to briefly talk about this, basically, effect sizes talk beyond, they describe basically how big an effect is, if not if it's just statistically significant. Um, so you can have, for example, an effect that's statistically significant, but maybe it's not clinically meaningful or meaningful in any sense. Like if you do a study with 1 million people and you find that, you know, providing some variable to them, some uh, giving, maybe giving them like chocolate and happiness, that's what you're studying. Maybe you find an effect, but it might not be that big of an effect, for example. We can also think about confidence intervals, and this is the precision of the estimate. So if we have a narrow confidence interval that provides more certainty, a wide confidence interval, more uncertainty. So again, how much of the effect are we actually seeing? In our study, do we see that it could be that it has anywhere between a null effect to a small positive effect? Or does our intervals provide us with confidence that the effect is going to be somewhere between like moderate and large, for example? So again, when you're doing a dive in some of these research studies, it's important to have an understanding of the statistics involved as well. Finally, one of the big parts of scientific literacy is understanding the scientific publication process. Looking for peer-reviewed studies is really important. There's this metric called impact factor that's basically citing, it's measuring how many times a paper has been cited by other people. So it's a rough guide of how impactful it is in the scientific community. But there's a lot of predatory and low quality journals that I get emails from these journals all the time. And it's important to know that just because something is published in a journal, it doesn't mean it's going to be necessarily peer reviewed or have a strong peer review process. There's also all types of conflicts of interest. If you're selling a product and the company that makes that product is paying you to do the study, that could create some bias for sure. So, some red flags to look out for: if there's an extremely small sample size, if correlation is reported as causation, if there's no control group, but they're trying to say there's a causal effect. Again, when we look at the data and the statistics and we see they're just talking about a p-value, but maybe there's a wide confidence interval or a small effect size. Or if there's a predatory journal involved, they say, "Oh, we published this," but the publisher is strange, it doesn't offer peer review, or maybe there's conflicts of interest for funding. So when we put all these pillars together, how I consider this in my mind and how I think about it is what I would like more people to do, like all of us to do, is apply all of these pillars in tandem. So if we see a headline online, such as "Coffee Cures Cancer," new study finds that drinking coffee may help prevent cancer, researchers say. We first reflect maybe how our biases play in. Like, I really enjoy drinking coffee, so I might want this to be true, and I should be aware of that before I even do a deeper dive into this research study. So, trying to just understand, okay, what is the emotional appeal, my emotional bias here, before I do the other types of literacy, and try to understand maybe like if I have a big coffee identity or something like that, how I might be especially motivated to process this finding. Then we do the media literacy techniques where we think about the source, if it's published on a reputable site, if they cite research here, is that research peer reviewed? And then does it match the actual study? So sometimes the headlines are very different than what the study says. And we can think about, who is publishing on this website, if they have a particular agenda. Is that why they're analyzing and describing this study a certain way? And then finally, we can think about those scientific components as well. So if they found that coffee cures cancer, do they have a sufficient sample size? Does their evidence make sense? Do the results and statistics have any glaring issues, such as a small effect size? And also trying to, again, think about correlation and causation. One big thing with health and interventions that I see is that when people generally recover from an illness, it could just be that they are naturally recovering from the illness and not that the medication they took or supposed medication actually made an impact. So with COVID-19, we know that most people recover. So it could be that people are just recovering from COVID-19 and it's not necessarily the supplement that they took that made them recover. So, in conclusion, I think all three of these pillars are really important to consider: psychological, media, and scientific. And I hope we can foster a community and society where we teach each other these skills and point out the importance of recognizing all of these skills together, because oftentimes we will selectively apply our media and scientific literacy to things that we're, psychologically have a bias for to want to believe is true or not true. But I really think it's important to consider how each of these pillars reflects on each other and help us evaluate information more critically and more thoughtfully. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you found this useful and interesting. If you're interested in asking me any questions outside of the Q&A here, feel free to email me, follow me on social media. I also have a newsletter and podcast called Misguided, which is also the title of my recent book, which I talk a lot about the psychology of misinformation. And I am happy to answer any questions that you have now. Thank you all so much for listening.